The chamber was enormous, a cathedral of cold light and ancient stone that floated at the heart of Etheris Prime, the station world where every galactic decision of consequence had been made for 10,000 years. And Ambassador Ilara Vasquez stood at its center, alone, surrounded by the judgment of 42 species who had already decided her kind was a problem that needed to be solved. She could feel their eyes on her, six-eyed Velnari elders, watching from their elevated thrones, the insectoid Dreth clicking their mandibles in open contempt, the crystalline Sorath pulsing with colors that she knew meant disgust, and she kept her back straight and her voice steady because that was the only weapon she had left. Beyond all reasonable boundaries, of breeding without restraint, of settling worlds that were never meant to be touched, and of evolving at a pace that threatens the balance of galactic civilization. Ilara listened to the charges and felt the familiar burn of anger rise in her chest. But she held it down, because anger would not save her people today. Only words could do that, and even words might not be enough. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward, and the chamber fell silent, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, the way a crowd goes quiet before an execution. "Honored members of the conclave," she began, her voice carrying across the vast space without a tremor. "You accuse us of expanding too fast, but let me remind this chamber of what that expansion brought. It was human engineers who developed the atmospheric processors that saved the Cathani homeworld from toxic collapse. It was human doctors who created the neural binding cure that ended that Sorath fragmentation plague. It was human soldiers who volunteered to fight in the Outer Rim Wars, when the Dreth hegemony threatened 3 species with extinction." She paused and looked around the chamber, searching for a single face that showed sympathy, and found almost none. "We shared everything we discovered," she continued. "Every medical breakthrough, every terraforming technique, every piece of technology, freely, without cost, without conditions, because we believed that was what it meant to be part of a galactic community." High Arbiter Zarel Keth leaned forward, his long gray fingers pressed together, and his 6 eyes narrowed as he spoke in a tone that made it clear the verdict had been written long before this trial began. "The Conclave does not dispute humanity's contributions, Ambassador. We dispute what humanity will become if left unchecked. Your species doubled its population 3 times in 2 centuries. You colonized 47 worlds in regions we designated as buffer zones, and your genetic drift is accelerating at a rate our scientists call unprecedented and dangerous. You are not like us, Ambassador Vasquez. You change too quickly, and change without control is chaos." Ilara wanted to scream. She wanted to ask them how a species that cured their plagues and fought their wars could be called dangerous. But she knew that logic had no place here, because this was not a trial, it was a ceremony, and the only thing being decided was how to dress up a decision that had already been made. The vote came swiftly, 39 in favor, 3 against, and the banishment edict was read aloud in 6 galactic languages, while Ilara stood motionless, her fists clenched at her sides. The terms were absolute. Humanity was to surrender all colonial holdings outside the Sol system within 1 standard year. All trade agreements were void, all diplomatic ties were severed, and a ring of automated sentinel stations would be placed around Sol's borders with orders to destroy any human vessel that attempted to cross. Humanity was to be sealed inside its own star system, like a disease locked in quarantine. The chamber erupted in murmurs of satisfaction as delegates began to file out, some of them not even looking at her, others glancing her way, with expressions that ranged from pity to triumph. The Dreth ambassador paused beside her and clicked something in his own tongue that her translator rendered as, "You should have stayed on your little blue rock where you belonged." Ilara did not flinch, did not respond, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply stood there, as the chamber emptied, As the lights dimmed to their standby glow, as the last echoes of alien footsteps faded into silence. Only then, alone in the vast and empty hall, did she allow herself one moment of grief. Not for herself, but for the 14 billion humans who would wake up tomorrow, learn that the galaxy had decided they were not welcome. She pressed her hand to her chest, where a small pendant hung beneath her uniform. A gift from her daughter, who was 7 years old, and who had drawn a picture of her mother standing among the stars. That daughter would grow up behind a wall of sentinel stations, locked away from the universe she had been born to explore. But Ilara Vasquez was not a woman who stayed broken for long. She reached into her coat and pulled out an encrypted comm device, a piece of technology so classified that fewer than 20 humans in existence knew it was real. And she activated it with a code that had been waiting in the system for 80 years, a contingency built by people who had always known this day might come. People who understood that humanity's greatest flaw in the eyes of the galaxy was also its greatest strength. She spoke 2 words into the device. Activate Exodus. And 10,000 light-years away, in bunker buried beneath the Swiss Alps on Earth, a console lit up with a soft blue glow. Director Maren Holt was sitting at that console, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and steady hands, and eyes that had seen enough classified data to fill a library. She watched the activation code scroll across her screen, and for a long moment she did not move. Then she opened a file that had been started 80 years ago and updated every single day since, a file containing blueprints and genetic research and propulsion theories and colony plans, and everything a species would need to disappear from the known galaxy and build something new in the dark spaces between the stars. Her assistant, a young officer named Torres, stepped into the room and saw the look on her face. "Director," he said, his voice tight with concern, "is it happening? Are they really banishing us?" Maren Holt closed the file and stood up, and when she turned to face him, there was something in her expression that was not fear and not sadness, but something far more dangerous. It was certainty. "They think they are burying us," she said quietly, "but they do not understand what humans are. We are not the kind of thing that stays buried. We are the kind of thing that grows." She walked past him, toward the door that led deeper into the bunker, toward the vast underground complex where 80 years of secret preparation waited to be unleashed. "Get me Admiral Achebe," she said without looking back, "and tell him to start waking up the engineers. We have a lot of work to do, and the Conclave just gave us the one thing we needed to do it." Torres swallowed hard and asked, "What did they give us, Director?" She paused at the door and looked over her shoulder, and for the first time in years she smiled, a thin, cold, patient smile that held in it the promise of something the 42 species of the Galactic Conclave had never considered. "Possible, a reason," she said, and then she walked into the dark, and the door closed behind her, and deep beneath the mountains of Earth, the machinery of the Exodus began to hum. The first 5 years were the hardest, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or had not been paying attention. Because when 14 billion people woke up to the news that the entire galaxy had locked them inside their own star system, like criminals in a cage, something broke inside the collective spirit of the human race. The colonies on Mars and Europa and Titan received the returning refugees in waves, millions of displaced families arriving on crowded transports, with nothing but what they could carry. Men and women who had spent their lives building homes on alien worlds, raising children under foreign skies, only to be told that none of it was theirs anymore, and that they should go back to where they came from. Rationing began within the first year. Food supplies that had once been supplemented by interstellar trade were now limited to what Sol system could produce on its own. And while humanity had the technology to feed itself, the sudden strain of absorbing so many displaced people, pushed every system to its breaking point. There were riots on Earth. In Sao Paulo and Lagos and Shanghai and Mumbai, people filled the streets and screamed at their governments, demanding to know why they had been abandoned by the galaxy they had helped build. And there were no good answers to give them, because the truth was simple and terrible, which was that the galaxy had never seen them as equals and never intended to. Admiral Ron Achebe stood on the observation deck of the orbital station above Earth and watched the blue planet turn beneath him, and he thought about the 47 worlds humanity had been forced to abandon, the cities they had built, the graves they had left behind, and he felt the kind of anger that does not burn hot, but burns cold, the kind that does not fade with time, but hardens into something permanent. "They expect us to die quietly," he said to Director Marin Holt, who stood beside him with a datapad in her hands, and that same thin smile she had worn the night the Exodus was activated. "They do," she agreed, "and for a little while we are going to let them believe they are right." That was the strategy. Silence. Because the Conclave had placed sensor buoys and automated sentinel stations around the entire Sol system. And those stations monitored every signal, every ship movement, every energy fluctuation within the boundary. So if humanity was going to build its escape in secret, it needed the galaxy to believe there was nothing to escape from. Director Holt and Admiral Achebe assembled a team, the best engineers, physicists, geneticists, and artificial intelligence architects humanity had ever produced. And they moved them all to a facility that officially did not exist, hidden inside the swirling atmosphere of Jupiter, where no alien sensor could penetrate the electromagnetic interference. They called it the Forge, and inside it, the future of the human race was being built, one blueprint at a time. Dr. Cale Maddox was the first breakthrough, a physicist from the University of Nairobi who had spent 20 years studying a theoretical concept that every conclave scientist had dismissed as impossible. He called it the Void Stream Drive, a propulsion system that did not use hyperspace lanes or jump gates, or any of the technologies the elder species had relied on for millennia, but instead tore temporary tunnels through the folded dimensions that existed beneath the fabric of normal space. The beauty of it was that the Conclave had never developed sensors for void stream travel because they had never believed it could work, which meant that a ship using a void stream drive could pass directly through the Sentinel blockade without triggering a single alarm. When Maddox presented his findings to Director Holt, she stared at the equations for a long time and then asked one question. "This?" His answer was 200, and she told him to start immediately. General Yua Tanaka took command of the construction program, a woman who had earned her rank fighting border skirmishes against pirates in the Outer Rim before the Banishment, a woman whose voice could make hardened soldiers stand straighter, and whose planning ability bordered on terrifying. She organized the construction of 200 arc ships inside Jupiter's upper atmosphere, each one 3 kilometers long, each one designed to carry 500,000 colonists, along with gene banks and seed vaults and fabrication systems and AI companions, and everything a new civilization would need to take root on an alien world. The arc ships were built from materials mined in the asteroid belt, and refined in secret orbital facilities disguised as weather monitoring stations. Every piece of the operation was hidden in plain sight, and the Conclave's watchers saw nothing because they were looking for warships and rebellion, not for arcs and exodus. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened on Earth. The human race, pressed together inside a cage of alien design, did not simply endure, but began to transform. It started with the artists, painters and poets and musicians, who channeled the collective grief of banishment into works so powerful that they seemed to vibrate with defiance. And it spread to the scientists, who attacked their research with a fury born from having everything to prove and nothing left to lose. and it reached the ordinary people, the farmers and teachers and factory workers, who looked at each other and decided that if the galaxy thought they were finished, then the galaxy was wrong. They called it the Quiet Renaissance, and it changed everything. New materials were developed that were stronger and lighter than anything the Conclave had ever produced. New medical technologies were created that doubled the healthy human lifespan. Agricultural methods turned the barren regolith of Mars into fertile soil, and new philosophies emerged that unified the fractured nations of Earth under a single shared identity for the first time in human history. And beneath it all, hidden from alien eyes, the Weavers did their work, a corps of geneticists and bioengineers who carefully and methodically enhanced the human genome, not through wild mutation, but through precise and guided evolution. They gave humanity resistance to hard radiation, tolerance for extreme gravity, the ability to process thin atmospheres, faster neural processing, and a dozen other adaptations that would allow colonists to survive on worlds the Conclave had deemed uninhabitable. 24 years passed, and the galaxy forgot about humanity. Conclave scholars wrote academic papers about the human decline. Alien news networks stopped mentioning Earth entirely, and the elder species congratulated themselves on having solved the human problem with such elegant efficiency. They had no idea what was coming. Ambassador Ilara Vasquez was 71 years old when she stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiance, hidden in the shadow of Saturn's rings. Her hair was silver, and her face was lined with age, but her eyes were the same fierce brown they had always been, and her voice still carried the same unbreakable authority. Behind her, visible through the bridge's panoramic viewport, 200 arc ships hung in formation, each one glowing softly with the blue light of charged void stream drives, each one carrying 500,000 human souls who had volunteered to leave everything they knew and scatter into the unknown. General Tanaka stood at the tactical display, her face calm and focused. Dr. Maddox stood at the engineering station, his hands trembling with the excitement of seeing his impossible theory about to become reality. And Director Holt, now in her 80s and confined to a hoverchair, sat beside Vasquez with the datapad that had started it all resting in her lap. 200 arcs, Vasquez said quietly, looking out at the fleet that represented the greatest secret humanity had ever kept. 200 chances to seed something new, each one going to a different part of the galaxy, to worlds no one has claimed because no one believed they could be claimed. She turned to face the bridge crew, and every person there saw in her expression the same look that had kept her standing alone in the conclave chamber 24 years ago. Not anger, not revenge, but the quiet and absolute certainty that humanity was not finished. "Scatter to the void," she said, and her voice was broadcast to every arc ship simultaneously. "Seed everything you find. Build, grow, adapt, and thrive. Make them wonder how they ever thought they could contain us. And whatever you do, wherever you go, never kneel again." The void stream drives activated. 200 tunnels tore open in the fabric of space, invisible to every sensor the Conclave had ever built. And one by one, the arc ships vanished into the dark. The sentinel stations detected nothing. The sensor buoys registered no anomaly. And the Conclave slept peacefully, dreaming of a galaxy where humanity had been neatly filed away and forgotten. They would not learn the truth for a very long time, and when they did, it would be far too late. The arc ships scattered like seeds thrown into a storm, and every single one of them landed somewhere impossible, because that had been the plan from the very beginning, to go where no sane species would follow, to claim the worlds that the Conclave had marked with red warnings and labels that read uninhabitable, to prove that the word impossible was just another word for untested. Captain Idris Okonkwo brought Arc 7 down through the atmosphere of a world that the Conclave's star charts had simply named XR7741, and flagged as a Category 9 death world. The sky was a permanent bruise of orange and black. The rain was acidic enough to eat through standard hull plating in minutes. The ground was covered in forests of silicon-based organisms that moved when you were not looking at them. And the gravity was 1.5 times Earth's standard, which meant every step felt like walking through wet cement. When the Ark ship landed and the first survey team stepped outside in their sealed environment suits, one of the younger colonists looked at the nightmare landscape and asked Captain Okonkwo if they had made a terrible mistake. Okonkwo, a tall man from Lagos with a shaved head and the calm, steady voice of someone who had already survived 3 things that should have killed him, looked at the acid rain streaking down his visor and said, "This is exactly what we wanted. Nobody will ever come looking for us here." He was right. Within a year, the colonists had developed acid-resistant building materials derived from the silicon organisms. Within 3 years, they had built a city of domed habitats, connected by underground tunnels. And within a decade, the Weaver enhancements had begun to express themselves in the children born on this world. Kids who could tolerate the thin acidic air for short periods without a mask. Kids whose bones were denser to handle the higher gravity. Kids who moved through this death world like it was home, because it was the only home they had ever known. They named it New Prometheus, and beneath its hostile surface, they discovered veins of a mineral that Dr. Maddox's theoretical models had predicted but never confirmed. Exotanium, a crystalline substance that could amplify energy output by a factor of 1,000, and which did not exist anywhere in conclave-controlled space. New Prometheus became a powerhouse, an industrial heart pumping energy and materials out to the other colonies through void stream supply lines that the conclave could not see and did not even know to look for. But New Prometheus was only one seed among 200. Ark 19 arrived at an ocean world with no landmass at all, just water stretching in every direction under a pale green sky, with waves that could reach 50 meters during the planet's violent storm seasons. The Conclave had catalogued this world as useless because their species needed solid ground, needed dry air, standing on something that did not move. The colonists of Ark 19 looked at the endless water and saw not a problem, but an opportunity. They built floating cities from engineered coral structures that grew and repaired themselves. They modified their food production to harvest the ocean's rich biological wealth. And over the generations, the Weaver enhancements adapted them to this world in ways that were beautiful and startling. Their children developed the ability to hold their breath for 20 minutes. Their skin took on a faint blue-gray tone that protected against the planet's unique radiation spectrum, and their eyes grew larger and more sensitive to light, perfect for navigating the deep waters where they built their most protected habitats. They called their world the Deep, and they became the diaspora's shipbuilders, because they had learned to grow vessels from the same coral-like superstructures that formed their cities, organic ships that healed their own damage and could be grown to any size given enough time and raw material. And then there was Ark 42, which found something that changed everything. Dr. Lian Zhao was the chief xenobiologist aboard Ark 42, a quiet woman from Beijing with a mind that worked like a precision instrument and a habit of noticing things that everyone else overlooked. When their Ark ship landed on a rocky world in a region of space so empty that the nearest known star system was 40 light-years away, she immediately noticed that the rock formations near their landing site were too regular to be natural. She organized a dig, and 3 meters beneath the surface they found the ruins. Structures made from a material that no scanner could identify, covered in symbols that no database could translate, and radiating a faint energy signature that had been pulsing steadily for what isotopic dating suggested was at least 3 billion years. They had found the remnants of the progenitors, species that had seeded all life in the galaxy billions of years ago. the species that every conclave elder race told stories about, but dismissed as mythology. The species whose existence would prove that every claim of biological superiority that the conclave had ever made was built on a lie. Because the data that Dr. Zhao and her team extracted from those ruins told a story that would shatter the galaxy's understanding of itself. The progenitors had not evolved naturally on any homeworld. They had come from somewhere else entirely, and before they vanished, they had scattered genetic templates across thousands of worlds like gardeners, planting seeds in every patch of fertile soil they could find. And those seeds had grown into the Velnari, the Dreth, the Sorath, the Cathani, humans, and every other intelligent species in the galaxy. Every single one of them was descended from the same source. There were no elder species and no younger species, no superior biology, and no inferior biology. There was just life, scattered and growing in different directions from the same ancient root. Dr. Zhao transmitted her findings to the consensus, the quantum-entangled AI network that linked every human colony in real time regardless of the distances between them. And within hours, every colony in the diaspora knew the truth, and every colony understood the weapon they now held. But the progenitor ruins offered more than just historical revelation. They contained technological principles that were so far beyond the Conclave's understanding that Conclave science looked primitive by comparison. New energy generation methods, new materials, new approaches to medicine and computation and space travel that made human technology leap forward by centuries in the span of decades. By the year 2450, 80 years after the Exodus, the diaspora had grown into something that would have terrified the Conclave if they had known it existed. 12 worlds, each one adapted to its unique environment, each one contributing something different to the whole. New Prometheus provided energy and heavy industry. The Deep built organic ships that were faster and tougher than anything the Conclave could produce. The Progenitor Colony provided technology and knowledge. And dozens of other worlds contributed food and culture and innovation and raw materials. The total human population across all colonies exceeded 90 billion, and every single one of them was connected through the consensus. Not a government, not an empire, not a hierarchy of any kind, but a network of equals sharing information and resources and making collective decisions through direct democratic participation facilitated by AI systems that were smarter and more ethical than any bureaucracy could ever be. They called themselves the diaspora, and they had no capital city, no throne, no single leader who could be captured or killed to bring the whole down. Down. They were decentralized by design, because Ambassador Vasquez had understood something fundamental about survival, which was that you cannot destroy something that has no center. And while humanity was building this extraordinary civilization in the spaces between the stars, the Conclave was rotting from the inside. Their Hypergate network, the foundation of their entire interstellar civilization, was aging and failing, and the elder species had grown so dependent on it that they had forgotten how to innovate, how to adapt, how to build something new when the old system stopped working. They had purged the one species in the galaxy that was reckless and stubborn and creative enough to solve their problems. And now those problems were growing worse every year, while they sat in their grand chambers and debated and argued and blamed each other for the slow decline that none of them would admit was happening. The irony was so perfect, it almost hurt. Conclave had banished humanity because they feared what humans would become, and in doing so, they had created exactly the thing they feared, while simultaneously destroying their own ability to compete with it. Somewhere in the quantum-linked void between 200 worlds, the consensus processed all of this data and reached a conclusion that it shared with every human colony simultaneously. The Conclave would find them eventually, because the galaxy was large, but not infinite. And when that day came, humanity needed to be ready. Not ready for war, ready for something much harder, ready to face the species that had thrown them away, and show them what that rejection had built. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with the quiet and undeniable proof that banishment had been the greatest gift the galaxy had ever given the human race. Warden Thessic Moore had served the Valnari border fleet for 37 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered anything that his sensors could not identify. Until the day his patrol squadron chased a group of pirates into uncharted space beyond the Conclave's outer rim, and found something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. The pirates had fled into a region that Conclave star charts marked as empty. No habitable worlds, no resources worth claiming, no reason for anyone to be there. But as Thessic's ships crossed into the unmarked zone, his sensor officer suddenly went very quiet. And when Thessic asked what was wrong, the officer turned to him with all four of his eyes wide and said, "Warden, there are ships out here. Many ships, and they are not ours." The convoy appeared on the display like ghosts materializing from nothing. 12 vessels, moving in a tight formation, each one unlike anything in the Conclave's database. Their hulls were a seamless blend of organic material and advanced metal alloys that seemed to shift and breathe like living skin. Their energy signatures were so alien that the Conclave sensors could barely register them, and they were fast. Faster than anything Thessic had ever seen. But the thing that made Thessic's blood run cold was not their technology or their speed. It was the signal they broadcast when his squadron hailed them, a signal in perfect galactic common that carried a voice both calm and impossibly confident. "Conclave vessels, you have entered diaspora space. State your intentions or change your course. This is your only warning." Thessic stared at his display and felt something he had not felt in decades, which was genuine fear. Not because the ships were threatening him, but because of the word that his translation system flagged as originating from a language that the Conclave had not heard in over 100 years. Ships were human. He pulled his squadron back immediately and sent an emergency transmission to Conclave Command, and the response was exactly what he expected. Confusion, denial, and then slowly dawning horror. The humans were supposed to be gone, sealed inside Sol system, behind a blockade of sentinel stations, withering and dying in silence. The last official report from the Sentinel Network had confirmed, just 6 months ago, that Sol system was quiet and showing continued signs of decline. So how were human ships operating in uncharted space, with technology that made Conclave vessels look like antiques? The answer, when it finally reached the Conclave's inner chambers, caused something very close to panic. Intelligence teams were dispatched to investigate. Long-range probes were sent into the regions where Thessic had encountered the human convoy. And what they found was not a single lost colony or a handful of refugee ships, but evidence of a vast and thriving civilization spread across a region of space larger than the entire Conclave had mapped in 10,000 years. The probes detected energy signatures on worlds that the Conclave had classified as uninhabitable. Industrial output on a death world that should have dissolved any structure within days. Massive biological constructions on an ocean world with no landmass. Communication signals bouncing between star systems through a medium that Conclave physics said should not exist. High Arbiter Zarel Keth, now ancient beyond reason, and kept alive only by machines that breathed for him and pumped his blood and stimulated his failing brain, received the intelligence report in his private chambers and read it 3 times before he believed it. And when he finally accepted the truth, he summoned the full Conclave for the first time in 40 years. The chamber on Aetheris Prime, the same chamber where Alara Vasquez had stood alone a century ago, was filled once again. But this time, the mood was not smug satisfaction. It was fear. "They escaped," Keth rasped, his voice amplified by the machines that kept him functioning. Somehow they escaped the blockade and built this, and we did not notice for 100 years. The conclave voted to send a diplomatic envoy, not out of any desire for peace, but because they needed information. Needed to understand the scope of what they were dealing with before they could decide whether to negotiate or fight. The envoy traveled to a neutral station on the border between conclave space and what the humans were now calling diaspora territory. And there, they met Ambassador Kiran Vasquez Achebe. She was 34 years old, the granddaughter of Elara Vasquez and Admiral Roan Achebe, born on New Prometheus and raised on the deep, educated through the consensus, and trained in diplomacy by people who had spent a century preparing for exactly this moment. She had her grandmother's fierce intelligence and her grandfather's tactical instinct, and she walked into the meeting room with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing exactly how much power stands behind you. The conclave delegation was led by a Velnari diplomat named Soreth, a younger member of Keth's inner circle, who had been chosen because he was considered moderate and reasonable. He entered the room expecting to find a desperate refugee leader willing to bargain for scraps of recognition. Instead, he found a woman who looked at him the way a mountain looks at the wind, unmoved, unimpressed, and completely aware that nothing he could do would change what she was. Ambassador Vasquez Achebe, Soreth began, adjusting his tone to what he hoped was diplomatic warmth. The conclave extends its greetings and wishes to understand the nature of the settlements that have been detected beyond our borders. Huron looked at him for a long moment, and then she activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with a map of the galaxy. But it was not the conclave's map, it was humanity's map, and it showed over 200 worlds glowing with the warm light of active civilization, spread across regions the conclave had never even surveyed. "These are not settlements," she said, her voice carrying the same steady authority that her grandmothers had carried in this very system 100 years ago. "This is the diaspora, 212 worlds, a population exceeding 90 billion, connected by a communication and transportation network that operates on principles your scientists have not yet discovered. We are not a colony, Ambassador Soreth. We are a civilization, and we are larger than the conclave." The silence in the room was absolute. Soreth recovered quickly because he was a trained diplomat, and trained diplomats learn to hide their shock, but his hands trembled slightly as he formulated his next question. "How did you cross the blockade without detection?" Kiran smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "We invented a way, which is what humans do when you tell us something is impossible." She then presented the progenitor data, the evidence that all galactic species shared a common genetic ancestor, that the hierarchy of elder and younger species was a fiction, that the conclave's entire philosophical foundation was built on a lie. And she presented it not as an accusation, but as a fact, the way a teacher presents a correction to a student who has been working from a flawed equation. The conclave delegation studied the data and could not refute it, because it was meticulous and complete and verified by AI systems that were more advanced than anything the conclave possessed. When the presentations were finished, Soreth straightened in his seat and delivered the message he had been instructed to deliver. The conclave acknowledges the extent of humanity's expansion and proposes a new accord. Humanity will accept conclave oversight of its territory and submit to regular inspections to ensure. Kiran interrupted him, and her voice was not angry, but it was final, the way a door closing is final. "No." She stood and looked at every member of the conclave delegation, and when she spoke again her words were chosen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them 1,000 times, because she understood that this moment would be recorded and studied and remembered for centuries. "You banished us. You took our homes, our trade, our place in the galactic community, and you sealed us inside our own star system to die. And when we did not die, when we instead built something greater than anything you had ever imagined, Your first instinct is to demand oversight and control. The answer is no, and it will always be no. She paused and placed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward so that Soreth could see clearly the word expression in her eyes, which was not hatred, but something far more unsettling. It was complete and total indifference to his approval. We do not need your permission to exist. We do not need your recognition to thrive, and we certainly do not need your oversight to govern ourselves. What we are willing to offer is open trade and mutual non-aggression, negotiated between equals, not as petitioners begging for readmission, not as subordinates accepting conditions, but as equals. Take it or leave it, Ambassador. She placed a small object on the table, an old diplomatic badge, tarnished and battered, with the name E. Vasquez engraved on its back, her grandmother's badge, carried out of the conclave chamber 100 years ago. My grandmother stood in your chamber and begged you to see us as partners, Kieran said, and you voted 39-3 to throw us away. I am not here to beg. I am here to tell you what has changed, and to give you one chance to. She left the badge on the table and walked out of the room, and the conclave delegation sat in stunned silence for a very long time. When the report reached Aetheris Prime, the conclave fractured. The Dreth hegemony demanded immediate military action. The Sorath called for isolation and denial. The Cathani quietly contacted the diaspora through back channels to explore trade agreements, and a growing faction called the Hollow Council argued that the conclave needed to accept humanity's terms before it was too late. High Arbiter Keth listened to them all argue and said nothing, because deep in what remained of his ancient mind, he understood something that none of them were willing to admit. The galaxy had changed while they were not looking, and the species they had thrown away had become something they could no longer control. The war started the way most foolish wars start, with pride, with fear, and with the absolute refusal to accept that the universe had moved on without permission. The Dreth hegemony assembled a war fleet of 10,000 ships, the largest military force the galaxy had seen in 3 centuries, and they did it in secret, or at least they believed it was secret, which was the first of many mistakes they would make in the weeks that followed. The Dreth's supreme commander, a massive armored figure named Vraxel, who had built his career on conquest and intimidation, stood on the bridge of his flagship and addressed his captains through an encrypted channel that he was certain no human could intersect. The humans are vermin who escaped their cage, he declared, his mandibles clicking with barely contained aggression. They have spread into territory that belongs to no one, which means it belongs to whoever takes it first. We will crush their nearest colony, capture their technology, and present the conclave with a victory that proves the Dreth are the true power in this galaxy. His fleet launched toward the nearest known human colony, a world called Haven's Rest, that the conclave's long-range probes had identified as a mid-sized agricultural settlement. Vraxal expected to arrive, overwhelm whatever meager defenses the humans could muster, and claim his prize within days. He did not know that the consensus had detected his fleet's mobilization 4 months before he gave the order to launch, because quantum-entangled communication meant that the moment a human intelligence operative on a conclave station noticed unusual Dreth military movements, every human colony in the diaspora knew about it simultaneously. By the time Vraxal's 10,000 ships arrived at Haven's Rest, the colony was empty. Every man, woman, and child had been evacuated through void stream corridors to safe locations across the diaspora. Every piece of valuable technology had been removed, and the only thing left behind was a single automated beacon broadcasting a message on all frequencies. The message said, "You came a long way for nothing. We hope you brought enough fuel to get home." Vraxal was furious. He ordered his fleet to spread out and find other human colonies, but every world they reached was the same, evacuated and empty. as if the humans had known exactly where the Dreth would go before they went there. Which, of course, they had, because the consensus processed information faster than any Dreth commander could make decisions. And then, Operation Dandelion began. It did not begin with weapons or warships. It began with small, fast voidstream vessels, appearing in regions of space far behind the Dreth battle lines, in star systems that the Dreth hegemony had controlled for centuries, in orbit around worlds where billions of non-Dreth species lived under Dreth occupation, and had lived under it for so long that they had forgotten what freedom felt like. The human ships did not fire a single shot. Instead, they broadcast the progenitor data on every frequency, in every language, showing the populations of those occupied worlds the truth that the Conclave had buried and the Dreth had suppressed. That every species in the galaxy shared a common origin. That no species was born to rule, and no species was born to serve. And that the hierarchies that had defined galactic civilization for millennia were built on a foundation of lies. The effect was immediate and devastating. On Dreth-occupied worlds across the hegemony, populations that had been quiet and obedient for generations suddenly erupted in protest and resistance. Not because the humans told them to fight, but because the truth gave them a reason they had never had before. Simultaneously, human ghost fleets began appearing around the Dreth Armada itself. Dozens of ships would materialize from voidstream tunnels, moving so fast that the Dreth targeting systems could not lock on. They did not attack. They did something far more humiliating. They surgically disabled the Dreth warships, one by one. Precision energy beams that cut through weapon systems and engine cores without breaching the hull, without harming a single crew member. Each disabled ship was left drifting and powerless but intact, its crew alive and healthy, with its communication systems still functional so they could call for rescue. Vraxol watched from his flagship as his mighty armada was taken apart like a child's toy being dismantled by an adult. Ship after ship going dark. Not destroyed, but rendered completely helpless. And the worst part was that he could not even fight back, because the human ships were too fast, too unpredictable, appearing and vanishing through a drive system his sensors could not track. He ordered his remaining ships into a defensive formation, but it did not matter. Need to engage in a straight fight, because they had already won, not through superior firepower, but through superior speed, superior intelligence, and the devastating psychological impact of an enemy that chose mercy over destruction. Within 3 months, the Dreth Armada was finished, not annihilated, not massacred, just stopped. 2/3 of their ships drifting without power, their crews evacuated to rescue vessels sent by other Conclave species who were beginning to realize that the humans could have destroyed the entire fleet and chose not to. The Dreth hegemony itself was crumbling from within, as the occupied species on their worlds rose up in peaceful mass resistance, inspired by the progenitor revelations, and supported by human aid ships that brought food, medicine, and communication technology to help the newly awakened populations organize. Vraxol himself was found alone on his powerless flagship, sitting in his command chair in the dark. Recovery team boarded his ship. He looked at them with something that was not anger and not fear, but was instead a kind of bewildered disbelief. "Why?" he asked the human officer who offered him water and a blanket. "Why did you not kill us? You had the power to destroy every ship in my fleet. Why did you leave us alive?" The officer, a young woman from the deep, whose blue-gray skin and large luminous eyes marked her as a second-generation ocean world colonist, looked at him with an expression that held no hatred and no triumph, and said simply, "Because we are not you." The Conch made it impossible to pretend that the old order was based on anything real. In its place, something new was built, the Open Assembly, a galactic body founded not on hierarchy, but on equality, not on the assumption that some species were elder and some were lesser, but on the proven scientific fact that all of them were branches of the same ancient tree. Humanity was invited to join as a founding member, and the invitation was delivered personally by a delegation that included representatives from 31 species, several of whom had voted for the original banishment edict and who now stood before the diaspora's representatives with expressions that carried the weight of a century of regret. Ambassador Kiran Vasquez Achebe accepted the invitation on behalf of the diaspora, and she did it in the new assembly chamber that had been built on neutral ground, a space designed by architects from 12 different species to reflect no single culture's dominance. Stood at the central podium and placed her grandmother's diplomatic badge on the surface. The same badge Ilara Vasquez had carried out of the old conclave chamber the day humanity was banished. The same badge Kiran had placed on the table during the first negotiation. Battered and tarnished, but unbroken, like the species it represented. She looked out at the assembly, and she saw Velnari and Dreth and Sorath and Cathani and dozens of other species. And she saw humans too, humans from New Prometheus, with their dense bones and acid-resistant skin, humans from the deep, with their blue-gray complexions and luminous eyes. Humans from 100 other worlds, each adapted in their own unique way, but all of them unmistakably and irreducibly human. 115 years ago, she said, and her voice carried across the chamber and across the galaxy, through the consensus and through every broadcast network that chose to carry the signal. This galaxy decided that humanity was too dangerous to be free. They said we grew too fast, changed too quickly, spread too far, and they locked us inside our own star system and expected us to wither and die in silence. She touched the badge on the podium, running her finger across the engraved name of the grandmother she had never met, but whose legacy she carried in every cell of her body. They were right about one thing. We do grow fast, we do change quickly, and we do spread far. But they were wrong about what that meant. It did not mean we were dangerous. It meant we were alive in a way that frightened species who had stopped growing long ago. She looked directly at the section where the Velnari delegation sat, and the ancient species who had once judged humanity from elevated thrones now sat at the same level as everyone else. You tried to cage us in one star. You thought silence would break us. But humans do not break. We scatter. We seed. We grow. You called it banishment. We called it a beginning. And now here we are. Not because we conquered you, not because we destroyed your fleets and burned your worlds, but because we outgrew the cage you built and the fear you carried. She paused and looked down at the badge one more time, and when she raised her head, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. The Exodus was never about running away. It was about running toward everything you told us we could not have. And we will keep running, keep growing, keep reaching for the next horizon, because that is what humans do. It is what we have always done. And no vote, no blockade, no edict from any chamber in any corner of this galaxy will ever be enough to make us stop. The chamber was silent for a long breath, and then the applause began, not from one species, but from all of them, and across 212 worlds and 100 billion human souls, the message was heard and understood. The Exodus was not over, never be over, because humanity was not a species that arrived at destinations. It was a species that created them, and the galaxy which had once tried to lock them away in the dark, now watched in awe as they walked back into the light and kept on walking, unstoppable and unafraid, into a future that had no walls and no ceilings, and no end.